blanket the Australian state of New South Wales, transforming day into night.
And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers.
Cracking down on eco-terrorism and being followed closely by the state.
For the second time in weeks, a young immigrant child has died while in custody at the U.S.
I'm here to
border.
help protect the water for the future generation. We come here to die. We have to.
Hello, my friends. Welcome to Fight Like an Animal. I'm Arnold Schroeder, and you can find the bibliography for this episode and all episodes of the podcast at againsttheinternet.com. The last website on the internet to use .com as an explicit part of the naming and marketing scheme, keeping that alive. And I've recently done some things to the website. I kind of streamlined it, redesigned it, and I also added a bunch of texts that just kind of I culled from various places from over the years. There's an article on the tactics of blockading trains and shutting down oil pipelines that initially appeared in the Earth First Journal. A few other things like that. I'm gradually just kind of gathering things I've written over the years and tossing them on the website in parallel to the podcast episodes. So go check that out if you're so inclined. And yeah, the website was kind of a placeholder for something I wanted to communicate in some format as I kind of spiraled into the crushing grief and sense of failure of coming off of a long-term organizing trajectory like a year and a half ago or so, and that was vague, tentative notion of a series of things I wanted to communicate has evolved into this podcast, and so the website now kind of centrally reflects the podcast as a format for the output of all this material that I've been working on for a long time. This episode took a minute to produce. I think we're somewhere right around the 2-week mark since the last one, and that was largely because of recording issues, and a key driver of those recording issues were fireworks. So I don't know if you've seen any of the media coverage or whatever on the unprecedented season of fireworks that we had in the United States of America a long time before the 4th of July. That was one sense in which it was unprecedented, was that it started way sooner, it started way earlier, and it was just like really a scale, like the sheer magnitude of explosions, the number and the intensity of them. They actually sounded different than most other fireworks that I've ever heard, and huge numbers of people were commenting on this in city after city throughout the United States. There were a bunch of really, really odd aspects of this particular sort of frenzy of fireworks. And so there's a lot of conspiracy theories, or whatever you want to call them, out there, that because they started right around the time of the uprisings in response to the murder of George Floyd, that this was some kind of concerted campaign to psychologically destabilize people, to make them feel like something really intense and frightening was happening, and to make them desire the presence of the police in their neighborhoods. And I know I saw some media describing how people in various cities had asked people who were setting off fireworks where they got all of them, and they said that all these kids were saying that they had managed to purchase like hundreds of dollars worth of professional grade fireworks for like $20, and that somebody just kind of drove into their neighborhood in an SUV and offered them this out of nowhere. And then another thing that I both read about happening in other cities and observed myself in the neighborhood that I'm staying in right now in the Bay Area was people just driving around and setting off fireworks from their cars and then just driving away. And that's kind of indicative of how, like, the sense in which it was really different was just that, I mean, yeah, sure, people set off fireworks in American cities all the time, and, you know, it's probably pretty fun. But they usually, there's usually like an atmosphere of revelry when that's happening. Usually if some fireworks are going off, there's some people hanging out on the street, and there's a crowd. There's, like, people are doing it for fun after all. And that was what was so uncanny and so striking about the epidemic of fireworks that was afflicting this neighborhood for just weeks and weeks and weeks, was that you would hear this just cacophony of explosions. It would just sound so disorienting and overwhelming, and you would go out and there would be nobody. You could walk around or you could drive around and the streets would be absolutely empty. I mean, absolutely empty. You would not see a soul, and it just felt really, really different than I can ever remember any moment like that feeling. And so, you know, like, people thought that the FBI or some other representatives of law and order, the existing order, were doing this to psychologically destabilize people and make people more amenable to the presence of the police. And I have no idea whether or not that is actually true. But the point that I would make is that it's plausible that would certainly not be any crazier than a whole lot of other things that the forces of law and order have done to maintain the existing order. And as the George Floyd uprising kind of evolves, as we've progressed into the stage that we always do reach in these moments of significant social rupture, where, as much as there are some amazing things happening in a bunch of different cities, and I have so much respect for the people who are holding it down right now and taking those risks and confronting that power in the ways that they are. But there is some sense, as is always the case, where we've reached this point where the possibilities feel a little less infinite. There's a little bit less of, like, a totally open-ended confrontation that could go absolutely anywhere happening. And there's more of a sense of parameters than there was, say, a month ago. So, you know, it's a worthwhile time to look at what the movement against police violence in this case did, like how they chose to pursue their objectives, how the people who operate the system of power they're opposing choose to pursue their objectives, how those are two very different strategic paradigms, and who's getting what out of what types of conflict. And, you know, so what I would note is that whether or not the actual fireworks anecdotes are indicative of some broad conspiracy, those kinds of conspiracies emphatically do exist on the part of the power structure, and there really is nothing remotely analogous occurring among movements in opposition to that power structure, right? So nobody who is angry that the police murder people and lock them up for no good goddamn reason whatsoever, nobody who is coming from that perspective is undertaking a strategy that could be really plausibly described as intended to psychologically destabilize an opponent or to amplify factional divisions among opponents. And these, of course, are measures that the power structure has been taking against movements for a very, very long time. I recently read a paper called Political Instability May Be a Contributor in the Coming Decade. Sounds like one of those cases of a specialist stating the exceptionally obvious, but it's interesting. The paper was written in 2010, published in Nature, and predicts that the years around 2020 will be a time of peak political instability in the United States. To quote from the paper, quantitative historical analysis reveals that complex human societies are affected by recurrent and predictable waves of political instability. In the United States, we have stagnating or declining real wages, a growing gap between rich and poor, overproduction of young graduates with advanced degrees, and exploding public debt. These seemingly disparate social indicators are actually related to each other dynamically. They all experienced turning points during the 1970s. Historically, such developments have served as leading indicators of looming political instability. Very long secular cycles interact with shorter-term processes. In the United States, 50-year instability spikes occurred around 1870, 1920, and 1970, so we could be due around 2020. We are also entering a dip in the so-called Kondratiev wave, which traces 40 to 60-year economic growth cycles. This could mean that future recessions will be severe. In addition, the next decade will see a rapid growth in the number of people in their 20s, like the youth bulge that accompanied the turbulence of the 1960s and 1970s. All these cycles look set to peak in the years around 2020. And so these authors have gone on to predict that I couldn't find the paper. It's in peer review right now, but all I could find was an article about the paper. But they've gone on to predict in their paper that's currently under review that within the next few years there will be open civil war in the United States of America. I think that one could look at what's happening right now and very meaningfully conceptualize it as a civil war, but in terms they feel comfortable describing something as a civil war, and they predict that there'll be a more outright conflict within the next couple of years. And they're using a tool for this prediction called the Political Stress Index. It looks at some of those dimensions that were just mentioned in the quoted text. Some stuff like the ratio of median workers' wages to GDP per capita, life expectancy, the number of new millionaires, etc. And whether or not this is true, whether the conflict that is currently underway progresses into a state of more open conflict with even more fatalities and all that, movements against police violence, movements against the underlying social and economic order that manifests this police violence have a few different forms of adversarial counterpower that they're contending against. One, of course, is obviously just the state and its overt violence. The people with the body armor and the grenade launchers and all that. And then another is the sort of grassroots militias, some of whom, as we're already seeing, are allying with movements against police violence. I feel like all militias that have mostly white people are invariably described as right-wing by people on the left, but I don't think that this conceptualization is really all that valid in a number of cases. So, and in some cases it's becoming kind of manifestly apparent that it's not valid because they're siding with Black Lives Matter at all. But then, certainly some militias are going to side with the state. So that's another faction that movements against the current social and economic order have to contend with. And then there is now, and would be in the case of more open conflict, always going to be a kind of amorphous network of actors, some of whom work for the state, some of whom have direct contact with the state, some of whom don't, who are engaging in what could be called psychological warfare or information warfare, generally just trying to destabilize movements. And anybody who has participated in social movements knows that this is largely the story of how they play out, that the internal divisions within them are just as much important predictors of where they go and what they do as any overt external repression that they face. And so this is a strategic domain in which there's a very clear asymmetry, right? The FBI, for instance, has for a very long time been working very assiduously to exploit divisions within social movements, and really social movements have done absolutely nothing that could be plausibly characterized as a strategy to exploit existing divisions within the FBI or within the power structure at large. And so without getting into too much game theory about it, sometime later in some other podcast, I'm going to do exactly that. But, we can just make the kind of intuitively obvious point that if a tactic isn't going to be reciprocated, then it's really unclear, especially because what movements are doing is essentially trying to affirm, they're asking people to validate sort of the better parts of their humanity. They're asking people to sacrifice. They're asking for social cohesion. They're asking for unity among people. Whereas entities that are trying to repress movements aren't asking anybody to sacrifice and aren't asking for people to manifest their better natures at all. They're attempting to exploit divisions and weakness and fear in people. And if these tactical, a movement has to embody something better than the power structure they're fighting, or what the fuck is the point of fighting? Of course. But if there's entire strategic and tactical domains that their adversaries are using that they're simply ignoring, that they're just simply not engaging with on any level, that's probably going to have some pretty significant consequences for the outcomes of the power struggles they engage in. And certainly if we look at this historically, it seems to be the case. It seems to be true that the FBI, for instance, has been winning against movements a lot more often than movements have been winning against the FBI. And I thought that it would be worth going through some memos that the FBI, internal memos from the FBI on their thinking around disorganizing, destabilizing, and suppressing social movements, just to illustrate how different this is than the strategic thinking that movements engaged in. I took all these from an amazing book called the COINTELPRO Papers that came out in the 90s, and it was kind of like a staple radical reading in the 90s. And there's commentary throughout the book, but it largely consists of, it's structured around memoranda that were obtained through what I can only imagine was a Herculean Freedom of Information Act request process about the COINTELPRO program, which officially was disbanded at some point, but really just continued without the explicit branding. And it's worth noting, if people aren't familiar, that the FBI was constituted specifically to suppress political movements. So to quote from the book just a little bit about that, in response to this massive upsurge of public sentiment to alter the U.S. socioeconomic and political status quo, on June 12, 1919, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer requested that Congress appropriate $500,000 to, quote, fight radicalism. It's where the FBI comes from. So, FBI memorandum dated October 4th, 1966. Subject, hoodwink. Purpose. The purpose of this memorandum is to recommend a long-range counterintelligence program designed to provoke a dispute between the Communist Party USA and La Cosa Nostra under the code name of Hoodwink. Objectives. A dispute between the Communist Party USA and La Cosa Nostra would cause disruption of both groups by having each expend their energies, time, and money attacking the other. This would help neutralize the activities of both groups, which are detrimental to this country. Skipping ahead just a little. The New York office has recommended a specific technique to initiate this program. This technique consists of anonymously forwarding one leaflet to a local La Cosa Nostra leader attacking the labor practices of one of his enterprises. The leaflet would ostensibly be published by a local party unit. A note with the leaflet would give the impression that it had received wide circulation. And then as you continue to read through these memoranda, it becomes pretty clear. It's never explicitly stated, but it's not like the FBI didn't know how the mob tended to handle disputes, right? As it becomes pretty clear as you read through these memoranda that they are trying to get the mob to kill people from the Communist Party. And, you know, that's pretty, like, it's pretty clever, whatever else you think about it, to get somebody else to do it rather than confronting your two enemies head on, to get them to simply attack each other. Okay, here's one dated November 15th, 1960, and this will really hurt if you have ever been to a single political meeting in your life, because if you have, you almost definitely have experienced that kind of like gnawing uncertainty, that tense, incessant anxiety that rather than the meeting progressing into people doing something together, some sense of division will emerge that will negate the social cohesion and absolutely nothing will get done. So this is about the Puerto Rican independence movement, and it describes the goals of the counterintelligence program against the Puerto Rican independence movement as 1, disruption and discord, 2, creating doubts as to the wisdom of remaining in the independence movement, 3, causing defections from the independence movement. And the suggested means of obtaining these desired ends are as follows. 1, exploiting factionalism within an organization. It goes on to explain factionalism is a common fault within pro-independence groups, and it is believed that this existing element can be developed, enlarged, and exploited. And then a little later it goes on, security informants operating inside the groups could, under certain circumstances, raise controversial issues at meetings, raise justifiable criticisms against leaders, and take other steps which would weaken the organization. Yeah, so not a bad point. Okay, the FBI on what they describe as black nationalist hate groups, by which of course they mean entities like the Black Panther Party. Their goals: 1, prevent the coalition of militant black nationalist groups. 2, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant black nationalist movement. 3, prevent violence on the part of black nationalist groups. Keep that in mind anytime some fucking liberal tells you that all the government wants is for somebody who doesn't like the government to break a goddamn window. 4, prevent militant black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability. Okay. Also with respect to, black nationalist hate groups, these suggestions are to create factionalism between not only the national leaders, but also local leaders, steps to neutralize all organizational efforts of the Black Panther Party, as well as create suspicion amongst the leaders as to each other's sources of finances, suspicion concerning their respective spouses, and suspicion as to who may be cooperating with law enforcement. In addition, suspicion should be developed as to whom may be attempting to gain control of the organization for their own private betterment, as well as suggestions as to the best method of exploiting the foreign visits made by Black Panther Party members. We are also soliciting recommendations as to the best method of creating opposition to the Black Panther Party on the part of the majority of the residents of the ghetto areas. And, the book is 490 pages, so we are truly just scratching the surface. I mean, you can read all about them trying to convince the leaders of street gangs that people in the Black Panther Party have put out hits on them, and, you can read about what they did to the American Indian movement, but what I've read suffices to give a general sense of the character of the efforts that they were undertaking, which, exactly none of which are about asking people to come together and sacrifice for the greater good or acknowledge their higher natures. Exactly nowhere will you find in this book a memo where the FBI is saying, well, in order to fight communism, I think we really just need to explain to people how serious of a threat it is and reach out to groups of people who aren't currently engaged in the fight against communism and ask them to rise to the occasion and be more noble than they're currently being, and to make sacrifices on behalf of this collective effort that benefits us all. In other words, exactly nowhere will you find in this book a memo where the FBI is talking about using the kinds of strategies that are exclusively presented within social movements as paths forward. In 100% of cases, what you will find are efforts that exploit weaknesses and fear and senses of division. In fact, it would be pretty reasonable to say that if you look at the strategies that movements have employed and the strategies that the power structure have employed, they're almost just entirely antithetical. And then, of course, you can ask the simple question, if we look at all these historical movements, the Black Panther Party, the Movement for Puerto Rican Independence, AIM, the Earth First Movement, all of these entities that have specifically been the subject of FBI counterintelligence programs, and ask who won, I don't think the answer is ever movements. And so just to read one more quote, this isn't an FBI memo, this is a testimony to Congress, or a report to Congress, the Doolittle Committee report. As long as anti-communism remains national policy, an important requirement is an aggressive, covert, psychological, political, and paramilitary organization, more effective, more unique, and if necessary, more ruthless than that employed by the enemy. Couldn't have said it better myself. Clearly, what they're doing is working, and clearly, it's not being reciprocated. So why not? Why aren't these tactics and strategies being employed by movements against our adversaries in the power structure? I mean, of course, there are some just very obvious barriers that exist for us that don't exist for them. They are, after all, the fucking power structure, right? So there is a huge risk differential. You know, the people in the FBI or the CIA or whatever do get to go around breaking into buildings and killing people and engaging in massive acts of subterfuge and generating horrible tragedies with very, very little risk of legal liabilities. And then, of course, there's a resource differential. I mean, they've got, planes, and they get paid salaries and all that. They get to go to training, I mean, there's some just really basic immediate differences, some square one kind of differences, but I don't think that entirely accounts for it. I think that there is also just a difference in the underlying psychology that produces these different worldviews. I think that the kind of people who operate within the power structure, to the extent that it has a coherent ideology, I mean, the ideology is just power itself. I think that those kinds of people have a distinctly darker psychology than people who are trying to make the world a better place. And as a result, this just gets into this thing that we return to in this podcast over and over again, which is the self-referentiality of political action. How what so many people are doing when they are taking measures to affect the external world is they're referring to themselves as a kind of general template for how people in the world are, And what they do ultimately reflects is this question of like, okay, well, if everybody is sort of like me, then how can I shift their behavior? And so, this is certainly true when movements sing and chant in the street or whatever. They're doing something that really would affect socio-political outcomes if everybody in the world were more like the people who were singing and chanting in the streets. And likewise, people who are in intelligence agencies or in the FBI see a darker world because they themselves are darker. And so they see a tactical and strategic playing field as implicitly obvious that just isn't implicitly obvious to a lot of us. And they take measures accordingly. And they're winning. Or to phrase it in a somewhat more affirmative manner, people in movements or take strategic measures that reflect a psychology built around affinity and solidarity, right? Because their underlying orientations are ones of affinity and solidarity. So the FBI's counterintelligence program was officially disbanded, I think in the 80s, with admonitions from Congress that the whole thing had been unconstitutional and un-American or whatever. And of course, the FBI never stopped doing what they were doing. They just stopped calling it the COINTELPRO program. But there have not really been nearly as extensive of troves of documents about their methods in the last couple of decades. But if we want to, as there were for, that phase of the 20th century that's documented in that book, the COINTELPRO Papers. But if we want to look at more recent case studies of people exclusively kind of orienting towards the politics of division and not really pursuing any clear agenda in their power struggles other than creating chaos and exploiting weakness among their enemies, we can, of course, look to Russia. And often when the kind of Western civilization, Western liberal media, rational discourse types are talking about Russia, the tone is very, very breathless. I have to restrain myself in this because I love on a purely aesthetic level listening to liberals talk about Russia, and I could indulge in way, way more quotation than is probably really warranted to make the point. But yeah, so here's a quote on Russia's approach to power politics in the current era from a book called This Is Not Propaganda: Adventures in the War Against Reality, that I think is pretty characteristic of how liberals talk about Russia. At endless panels in think tanks in Washington, London, and Brussels, military theorists, journalists, and officials have tried to make sense of the Russian approach to war and international conflict. Some call it full-spectrum warfare, others non-linear war, yet others ambiguous and gray zone warfare. In Eastern Europe, hybrid war state research centers have sprung up, where hybrid seems to be a diplomatic way of not saying Russian. There are some things that at least a few experts can agree on. First, that the Russian approach blurs the line between war and peace, resulting in a state of permanent conflict that is neither on nor off. And in this conflict, information campaigns play an important role, summarizing the aims of Russian next-generation warfare. Janis Berzins of the Latvian Military Academy describes a shift from direct annihilation of the opponent to its inner decay, from a war with conventional forces to irregular groupings, from direct clash to contactless war, from the physical environment to human consciousness, from a war in a defined period of time to a state of permanent war as the natural condition in national life. Yeah. That's a liberal talking about Russia, all right. And I guess I just think it's funny because what Russia is doing is not really that different than what has constituted the status quo of international intrigue throughout, say, the entire Cold War, like all of modern history or whatever. It's just that they're doing it better than like Western liberal democracies are doing it, and so the proponents of Western liberal democracy have kind of been reduced to just like describing it as some sort of terrifying new specter. On some level, it kind of has this weird resemblance to the way that every like decade or so for a long time, commentators would be like, these kids in the ghetto are unlike anything anybody's ever seen before. They're crazy ass animals out there. Like, these people have no empathy or whatsoever. It's just like, this is not really true. But whereas the West had a sort of fairly cohesive, like an ideological coherence and a shared vision and like some institutional coherence, and were actively like contending for power against Russia at one point in history, we've kind of reached our like hyper-decadent decline of the Roman Empire phase, whereas Russia is still cold and hungry. And so there just is this like huge disparity now in how much these tactics are being used by entities within the West, but it's just really not all that breathtakingly novel to be trying to like sow division and discord and to exploit weaknesses among your enemies. I would say that what really has fundamentally changed, and we will certainly return to this later, is that now there's the internet. That's what's different about information warfare, information campaigns, all of these measures that have been around forever and, constitute like the meat of espionage textbooks or whatever. What's different is the internet. So, but what I want to do to stay true to this show's premise is I want to talk about, if we're always going to be looking at how people contend for power and how what they believe maps to a sort of underlying psychology with many innate elements, and how that underlying psychology maps not only to a worldview, but also a means of contending for that worldview, for a strategy and a set of tactics one uses in sociopolitical contestation. Let's talk about Putin and the Russian military and political establishment, since Russia is kind of the premier entity. Obviously, the United States, the FBI, is still doing this kind of thing. They're still sending informants to meetings. They're still trying to amplify divisions. But since Russia's kind of like the premier entity that is playing this kind of politics right now, let's examine the psychology of that power structure a little bit and see what it can tell us. I mentioned in the last episode that some commentators describe Vladimir Putin as post-ideological because he has no ideology whatsoever. And I quip that this could be just as profitably described as pre-ideological, right? That power for the sake of power has been the premise of power throughout much of the human experience. Masha Gessen wrote this great book about Putin called The Man Without a Face: The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. And she chose that title to really emphasize this point, that he is not about anything. He has no, socio-political ideology per se, but he also just doesn't really have much content to his character in general, other than a desire to be respected and a desire for power. The government of Russia is very much a government as an intelligence agency would run it, or as a criminal enterprise would run it. It's a fusion of those two things. And so, yeah, it's not just that he doesn't really have particularly remarkable beliefs or have much of anything to say about the world, but he's just a generally very unremarkable person. What she documents in her book is how little of an impression he made on really anybody at all before he took power. As he was ascending power, in 2000, a biography was kind of like hastily assembled about him to give him some kind of identity whatsoever. I think it kind of largely failed, but he talks to his biographers in that book about his desire to join the KGB being the result of the influence of books and movies that he consumed as a teen. And he says, quote, "There is nothing special about that." And he's right. There's nothing special about it. There's just nothing special about almost any aspect of his career or his life trajectory before his ascent to power. He joined the KGB in the 1970s. It's not particularly clear he ever truly left. He wasn't a particularly good spy. It's not like he was the eminent, like, arch espionage guy who masterfully, like, navigated power for decades to go on to rule Russia. His first posting after spy school is described by Gessen as just short of failure. He was posted somewhere kind of obscure without really a ton of responsibility. And so just to give some sense of how little of an impression he made on anybody, or really just how little of an identity he possesses of any kind. There's this idiosyncratic turn of phrase that is often employed to describe very specifically people like him, like KGB operatives and Russian bureaucrats and whatnot, which is like gray men. And he very much is a gray man. So here's a quote from Gessen's The Man Without a Face on the utter obscurity that Putin emerged from to take power. On January 26, 2000, exactly 2 months before the election, the moderator of a Russia panel at the annual World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, asked, "Who is Mr. Putin?" Chubais, the man who had 7 months earlier argued that Putin would make an ideal successor, was holding the microphone when the question sounded. He fidgeted and looked questioningly at a former Russian prime minister sitting to his right. The former minister, too, was clearly unwilling to respond. The panel's 4 members started looking back and forth at each other anxiously. After half a minute of this, the room exploded in laughter. The world's largest landmass, a land of oil, gas, and nuclear arms, had a new leader, and its business and political elites had no idea who he was. But then there's the gang. So he's not about much of anything, but then there is the gangster aspect. The one thing, Putin doesn't seem to be particularly concerned with presenting an opinion about much of anything in the world, but the one thing that he does seem recurrently concerned with conveying about himself and his relationship to the world is that he's a fucking gangster, right? And he talks about this a lot with his biographers in 2000 about, like the thing that both he and the people he gives them access to interview really convey over and over again is how tough he is, how he grew up hard, how he was a thug, how like the courtyard of the housing development that he grew up in was like a place where motherfuckers had to carry themselves. And he just goes on and on about this. He over and over again portrays himself as impulsively aggressive. Over and over again, he and his friends describe like fist fights that he was in and how he was just out of control, like motherfucker was crazy. And this is kind of characteristic of gangsters in general. Like they are often this is a big generalization, but it is like statistically kind of true in my observation that gangsters often don't have much of a premise other than I'm a gangster, you should respect me, I get what I want. I can take things from you, you know. So to give some sense of how he talks about this is from an interview with his biographers. They ask him, why did you not get inducted into the Young Pioneers until 6th grade? Were things really so bad? Of course, I was no pioneer. I was a hooligan. They ask, are you putting on airs? You were trying to insult me. I was a real thug. You know, like this really is how this person talks about himself. And he never bothers to talk about himself in other terms. He never, for instance, says, I'm this guy who thinks this about the world and I'm trying to affect this set of outcomes in the world. Because that's just not what Putin is about. He's about power and respect for the sake of power and respect, much like dudes on corners. So how does a person who thinks this way seek power? And how does the entity in which he is embedded, the KGB, which became the FSB, of which he is a psychologically representative member, how do they seek power? Putin was in the KGB during the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think it is pretty safe to say that most of the people in the KGB were not real hyped on the whole end of the Soviet Union, begin the process of democratization thing. And of course, the people who were in the KGB then, who are now in the FSB, are literally the same people in a huge number of cases, or just in like psychological, perceptual, and behavioral terms, the same kinds of people. And of course, there has ostensibly been this radical ideological shift between the Soviet Union, you know, the end of history, workers' paradise, etc., and Russia as it currently exists. But the people who've actually been maintaining power in Russian society under either ideological pretense are the same motherfuckers, right? And I think that the KGB was opposed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union not out of any adherence to the ideological pretenses of communism or anything like that, but simply because they saw it was a diminishment of power, and it was a diminishment of the kind of power that they maintained. And that is the one and only thing that entities like the KGB/FSB/Putin are about. So you have the situation where the like hardliners, the people who wanted to maintain a more authoritarian power structure in the Soviet Union, undertook a coup attempt as it was in like the kind of last stages of collapse and dissolution on August 19th, 1991, at 6 in the morning, state radio in the Soviet Union began broadcasting political communications from Soviet federal ministers who were claiming that they were removing Gorbachev from power. And what actually happened is a little bit difficult to interpret, but it leaves only the certainty that something was certainly going on behind the scenes. So the coup attempt lasted for 3 days only. 3 people died in it. A number of arrest warrants were issued for people in power who were liberalizing democratizing the Soviet political system. But most of these arrest warrants, almost all of them, were not executed. These people weren't actually arrested. And there was kind of just this like tense, weird, I don't know, like bizarrely restrained situation that played out where it was really much more like a standoff, or I guess one could say like a demonstration of power, than it was like an actual overt conflict. So to again read from The Man Without a Face about the outcome of this coup attempt. So what was it? Why did the coup, so many months in the making, fall apart so easily? Indeed, why did it never really take off? Why were the democratic politicians, with the exception of Gorbachev, allowed to move around the country freely and have telephone conversations, Why were none of them arrested? Why, in the 3 days that they ostensibly held power in the Soviet Union, did the hardliners fail to capture the main communication or transportation hubs? And why did they fold without a fight? Was the coup simply a mediocre attempt by a group of disorganized failures? Or was there something more complicated and more sinister going on? Was there, as Saleh ultimately came to believe, a carefully engineered arrangement that allowed Yeltsin to remove Gorbachev and broker the peaceful demise of the Soviet Union, but also placed him forever in debt to the KGB? And, of course, we don't know the answers to these questions, but, and what we do know is that something happened behind the scenes. There was some display of power that just kind of ambiguously resolved itself in some way nobody's particularly clear on. And then we had approximately 10 years of very incoherent, very drunken rule by Yeltsin as the country kind of economically and politically just declined into chaos. And then we have this scenario where the Russian political elite just sort of acknowledges Putin as the obvious successor to Yeltsin, even though, as we discussed earlier, absolutely nobody can really articulate a single thing about this guy, right? So Putin comes to power, and then this power is consolidated very rapidly because of a series of bombings of apartment buildings that takes place all throughout Russia, that is attributed by the Russian government, by Putin, to Chechen separatists, but which is very, very widely believed by both, Western intelligence agencies, people in Russia. There's extremely convincing evidence. Gessen makes a great case in The Man Without a Face. It's widely believed that the FSB is behind the bombings of these apartment buildings, which killed hundreds of people, but set the stage for a rapid consolidation of power and for Putin to negate a bunch of institutional barriers to authoritarian rule that had been kind of, somewhat like weakly developed, but developed nonetheless in post-Soviet Russia. And so that's what happened, they did something. They had some kind of coup, something behind the scenes happened where Putin could just kind of emerge out of nothingness and become the Russian leader. And then they just killed a bunch of Russian people to create an authoritarian regime where there was no challenge to Putin's power. And now we have Russia as the political entity that we know it today, doing their amazing job of political subterfuge all over the world with no ideological pretense and no real even clear end game or kind of in a lot of cases they undertake campaigns where they don't actually have a concrete objective other than simply to create chaos, other than to simply pit all against all so that nobody is stronger than Russia. So we have all the stuff that most people are a little bit familiar with, at least. We have Russia organizing fake Black Lives Matter protests, Russia organizing pro-Trump rallies, Russia organizing anti-Trump rallies. I like the one that Russia did in 2016 where they organized a pro-Trump rally where they had an actor in a Hillary Clinton mask get into a cage. I think that's a very nice touch. You have the base, that neo-Nazi organization in Washington that was training to attack infrastructure and all that. And there's fairly decent evidence that the person who initiated that effort is a Russian operative. He certainly lives in Russia. And the breathless liberals who talk about these Russian methods of social and political subterfuge that have been used by many parties, certainly emphatically, including the United States of America. We have them kind of making the Russian approach sound more unique and, I don't know, kind of more like apocalyptic than it arguably is and kind of like making it more academic than it really is by calling it the Gerasimov Doctrine. This is after General Valery Gerasimov, who gave a speech in 2013 that was reprinted in a Russian newspaper called the Military Industrial Courier. And he's the chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation. And as an article in Politico magazine describes the Gerasimov Doctrine, Gerasimov took tactics developed by the Soviets, blended them with strategic military thinking about total war, and laid out a new theory of modern warfare, one that looks more like hacking an enemy's society than attacking it head on. And, you know, the guy who actually coined this term, the Gerasimov Doctrine, wrote a piece in Foreign Policy called "I'm Sorry for Creating the Gerasimov Doctrine," where he says exactly what I just said, essentially, where he's just like, this is not actually, or this was a placeholder phrase that he used in a blog where he just like added some commentary to the speech that this dude gave. But he's very much like, this is not a doctrine. This is not conceptually distinct from power politics as they have ever existed. But you know, the speech is really interesting. Anybody who's trying to make a revolution, you know, it's an interesting, it's not conceptually dazzling, but it's worth reading, because it talks a lot about the combined effect of uprisings, you know, of like social movement strategies, of mass mobilizations and all that, with military tactics and other efforts at destabilizing political systems, like disinformation campaigns. And so it's pretty interesting. But here, again, is that point about self-referentiality that I always want to keep coming back to, because what the speech is really concerned with discussing recent mass mobilizations, recent as of 2013, mass mobilizations anywhere in what Russia vaguely considers its sphere of influence. So, you know, he's talking about the Arab Spring, he's talking about the color revolutions, he's talking about the Euromaidan revolt in Ukraine, and he, you know, he's very much concerned with, and the Russian political and military establishment is very much concerned with negating the ability of such movements to affect power and political outcomes and to change regimes. And so this is what's so fascinating, is that the Russian political and military elite really believes, Putin, Gerasimov, all those people seem to legitimately believe that there really is no such thing as an organic protest movement, that any mass mobilization that we witness has the signature of, you know, the CIA or clandestine Western interests of some variety or another in it. And they really do. They perceive all those movements that I just mentioned, Arab Spring, the Euromaidan revolt, all of that, as exclusively like the orchestrations of Western intelligence agencies. And, you know, of course, Western intelligence agencies have done a whole lot of like funding of, you know, in addition to armed resistance movements, protest movements and stuff like that. So that doesn't help. You know, the suspicion has some historical validity, certainly. But, you know, of course, some of these movements exist for precisely the reasons that their participants say they exist for. And so this is so fascinating, because Russia perceives all protest as illegitimate and a subterfuge of a major state power. And then Russia itself is the state power that's most involved in creating fake protest movements and in creating chaos through amplifying social divisions within enemy states and things like that. And I think that's one of the most beautiful and convincing illustrations of this phenomenon of the self-referentiality of everybody's approach to power politics, because they really believe this. This isn't, I mean, the Russian military and political establishment certainly capable of saying all kinds of things, you know, of engaging in all manners of deception and saying all kinds of things out of strategic calculation. But this is one crazy thing that they appear to truly believe. Just as people in the power structure here in the United States may be incredibly duplicitous and say all manner of things they don't really believe, but they also do actually just hold a bunch of really idiosyncratic, totally goddamn insane beliefs that they're legitimately committed to. This is one such case in Russia. They really believe that the world, like that all social rupture that we see on the world stage is a vast conspiracy against their power, and then they go ahead and create a massive amount of social rupture as a vast conspiracy against other people's power. It's really interesting. And so, you know, this strategy that they're undertaking is like, you can call it full spectrum, total, dark, inverted, hybrid, warfare, whatever, right? But really, if you wanted to very concisely characterize what they're doing, you could do a lot worse than to describe it as a strategy of divide and conquer, right? And that's not really a breathtaking new insight strategically, but it's not a strategic paradigm that everybody is operating in. It's one that the truly power-obsessed seem to remember that others seem to neglect, right? So it's the strategic paradigm of the kind of people who don't have anything to say about the world per se, other than I want to be able to control it, right? Who don't have any ideology or really any premise for their existence other than you should respect me. I can get what I want. I have power. And that's really worth noting because they're doing a really great job. For the actual resources that Russia has at its disposal, they are doing an amazingly outsized job of influencing the landscape of power in the world at large. The fact that these very old strategies have new characteristics and new possibilities because of the internet is also certainly illustrated by the example of Cambridge Analytica, which Cambridge Analytica is like directly an evolutionary result of the Cambridge Psychometrics Center, which is constantly churning out papers with titles like Automatic Personality Assessment Through Social Media Language, and Musical Preferences Are Linked to Cognitive Styles, and things like that. And so they're very much like the work that people like the Cambridge Psychometric Center are doing is exactly what I'm talking about when I say that there's an incredibly rich, fascinating landscape of cognitive differences that are being mapped out in the human species that have everything to do with power, but also just everything to do with kind of every other aspect of the human experience. And they're all very interrelated, you know, like empathy predicts musical preferences and things like that. You know, there's a very active realm of research where people are mapping out what I refer to as all of humanity's different cognitive tribes, all the different perceptual niches that people occupy, and all the correlations between perceptions of seemingly unrelated issues or attitudes or behaviors in seemingly unrelated domains. And this is a landscape of differences that social movements are just flat out ignoring, right? They are focusing on other distinctions between people which are meaningful and important and have to be factored into analysis, but, you know, they're focusing exclusively on ideology, on class, and identity in the terms of, you know, race, gender, sexual orientation, etc. but not in differences in people's brain structure, not in baseline psychological differences between people, not in differences of perception. And Cambridge Analytica is an incredible illustration of how paying attention to those differences can net you real strategic gains. That it provides an opportunity to contend for power in ways that you otherwise just absolutely do not have. So, Cambridge, like what they actually did in their work, and again, this is one of those things where kind of like Western civilization, like Western liberal democracy types were like appalled and horrified at this supposedly like whole new breed of information warfare or whatever, and it's like, it's really not clear that what Cambridge Analytica did was actually that far outside of the domain of politics as it's ever existed, electoral politics. Like, what did they do that Republican operatives going around distributing leaflets about the Democratic opponent's illegitimate crack baby didn't do? Like, I don't think that Cambridge Analytica actually represents like a new strategic domain. They're just able to do things that have been done for a long time much better because the process is data-driven and involves an acknowledgement of all of these interesting differences between people. So like what they actually did is they took $1 million and they threw out some like personality surveys on Facebook. People love to take personality quizzes. That generated a bunch of obviously these quizzes asked no explicit political questions whatsoever, but that's exactly the point I'm making, is that they were able to take all these ostensibly unrelated psychological dimensions and predict very accurately a number of aspects of political perception and political orientation, and then they were able to target from that data that they generated to potential voters and create all this dissension, create defections, create like disaffection with Democratic candidate among people with certain political orientation, motivate people to vote Republican among people with other sorts of political perceptions. And what they did really probably did actually have some fairly significant impact on the outcome of the 2016 election. And in the terms of like presidential elections in the United States of America, $1 million is a very, very, very small amount of money to be spending for that kind of impact. But what they're doing and what Russia has done in a number of cases, trying to influence elections and, in other regards, really does illustrate how the internet has kind of leveled this playing field. Like, you don't need to be the CIA to engage in a massive disinformation campaign or to conduct information warfare or psychological operations or whatever. People can simply do this if they want to. To illustrate that point, I'd like to describe an undertaking that a few friends and I made that really didn't go anywhere, but I think that the premise is compelling and illustrative. So like the beginning of 2019, a few friends and I started kicking around the notion of a group called Law and Order Citizens for Biden. And I don't think that, the election of a progressive Democrat is the end game or anything like that. But I do think it matters. I think that it is a huge difference in a larger political process if the person who has an office like that of the United States president shares any of the same perceptions of the world as you or I do. And so the notion was that there would be some progressive challenger to Biden. This was like way before all of the different candidates emerged with all their distinct personalities. And it was kind of before Biden declined really significantly, before miraculously and inexplicably regaining his former stature. And so the notion was that there would be this contest between Biden and some progressive Democrat. We hoped Bernie Sanders, or, we thought maybe Elizabeth Warren would be worth doing this for. It was kind of before she allied so conspicuously with the existing power structure as she did towards the end of the Democratic primary. But Law and Order Citizens for Biden was essentially like a Blue Lives Matter pro-Biden group, right? So it was an entity, rather than being a smartass on the internet, making memes about Biden's support, his authorship of the 1994 crime bill and his support for a huge litany of just horrendous policies that have resulted in mass incarceration. We wanted to make a group that was like a pro-cop group that was promoting Biden because of all these horrible things he'd done, and we wanted to target the communications of that group to black voters in swing states who were, like the more like the kind of typical, like, more conservative black voter who just kind of tends to vote for a Democratic Party establishment candidate, whoever they happen to be. And we wanted to really deeply alienate them by just talking a bunch of Blue Lives Matter shit about how great Biden is and how we need to keep locking up even more people and we need even more police on the streets and we need to get, to kind of recapitulate all of that style of political campaigning that used to characterize both Democratic and Republican politics in the 80s and 90s, of like the whole tough on crime thing. We're like, yeah, we gotta make video ads that have that like jail doors slamming shut sample that used to seriously be used in political ads all the time, that like Biden, right? Law and Order Citizens for Biden. And the way that, there were a bunch of twists and turns in the Democratic primary that we absolutely did not anticipate at the time, but the way that it actually played out, with Biden taking South Carolina with the aid of black voters, like older black voters, age is a really key predictor here, who were just kind of going to vote for whoever they felt was sort of the consensus candidate of the Democratic Party establishment, with them propelling him to his first victory in the primary, and then that kind of cohering the entire perception of everybody, black or white, who tends to vote exactly that way for just whoever the consensus Democrat is, and that influencing the outcomes of all of those subsequent primary races. The way that the primary actually played out, it really seems like Law and Order Citizens for Biden was a pretty fucking good idea. And it just didn't happen because we really needed funding. It was a tiny handful of people who were working on this, but we weren't trying to pull the whole thing off with like organic, like social media activity or whatever. We wanted to actually target ads to the right voters, and that just would have required money that we sought out funding, and we failed on that front, so it didn't really go anywhere. But we actually, as we were working on that, we were also just generating a pretty massive trove of different sort of like political identities that we wanted to assume on the internet to various ends. So like going back to what I was talking about towards the beginning of like the forces that in a state of like open conflict that one might be more comfortable calling a civil war, or now in the conflict that we're seeing play out today, the forces that would be arrayed against movements, against the police, against the existing political, economic, social status quo, like certainly the militia movements, the elements of the militia movement that would oppose movements against the police is not ideologically cohesive fucking at all, right? And so we wanted to affect a bunch of identities that would amplify a sense of division within that broad sphere. Like to give an example, the relationship of like the white supremacist, like far right, sort of like broad amorphous landscape to anti-Semitism or to Jewish people is so incoherent and internally contradictory, right? There are certainly a bunch of fervent Christians who are, who, you know, are basically like really pro-Israel, kind of have that like typical right-wing political establishment position that's like, well, we're just trying to bring about the Christian apocalypse, and, you know, Israel plays a key role in that. And then, of course, there are all the people who feel like Christianity was an act of colonization of white people, and who perceive, you know, Jewish people as like a sort of arch nemesis of the white race or whatever. And that just seems like very, very fertile ground for sowing division. We wanted to not only like explicitly talk about Jewish people, but also just make a more kind of overt attempt at anti-Christianity a central part of like the right-wing militia discourse, and like just amplify that discord between people who see Christianity as something that was imposed on white people and orient more towards like religious and spiritual traditions as they existed in Europe previous to Christianity, and all the gun-toting motherfuckers who are just like Christians, right? And that's, you know, that's just like one example, but we wanted to, I don't know, we found it really, really fun to generate all these notions of different forms of division that we could exploit within different social and political echelons, which I tried to find for this episode. I tried to find psychometrics that are used by intelligence agencies to recruit people. And I didn't look very hard, but I couldn't do it. I wanted to take the tests. Anytime I cite psychometrics on this podcast, I've always taken the tests myself. But, you know, I like managed to read a few things by people about their experience of being psychologically tested for induction into an intelligence agency, but I couldn't actually find the tests. But, you know, so like, I guess lacking that, I would just say it seems like you're the kind of person who would be good at this sort of thing if you think about wreaking havoc in some socio-political echelon and amplifying divisions in some socio-political echelon, and it brings you like a sense of joy, and you find yourself feeling like clever, and you kind of find yourself like giddily generating ideas for producing chaos, right? You know, and I found that the people I was working with and myself were such people, and so this is one strategic and tactical domain in which I think it's actually just eminently plausible to talk about social movements adopting some of the methods that are used by their opponents. I think that there absolutely are people with a more like egalitarian and ecological worldview who would be very, very, very good at this kind of thing. Like really the fundamental requirement is an aptitude at understanding people, and an aptitude at understanding people and empathy are intimately linked on some level. I really think on a biological process level. I will talk about this at some point, some episode. These things are homologous; they're the same thing, and we can see endless aspects of social and political conflict where the structures that movements are opposing are not monolithic at all. This came up in a really conspicuous way recently during the George Floyd uprisings, as Trump attempted to use the military in a pretty heavy-handed way to suppress protests, and people like high-ranking figures within the military were rebuking him or refusing in really significant ways, you know. So like those who hold power are not monolithic at all. They are riddled with conflicts and internal divisions, and for as much as they have been amplifying conflicts within movements for decades and even centuries, I think it is long past time that people amplify conflicts among them. And that is kind of the thesis of this show, this particular episode of this show, is that that's really plausible. That's really attainable. The thesis of this episode is that there are a whole lot of people who are already spending, I mean, in the case of my efforts, we wanted funding. We didn't want to organically organize for a variety of reasons I don't want to get into, but there are a whole lot of people spending a whole lot of time on the internet talking about politics with people who agree with them to a significant enough extent that they feel compelled to like talk about the right approaches to politics or whatever, argue about their perspectives. And so the thesis is that some of these people could probably be both a whole lot more effective and be having a whole lot more fun, not arguing with their friends, but pretending to be their enemies, and watching the chaos that results. And so, friends, that's where I'm going to leave it this time. My conclusion is that the people who are winning in the contest for power that characterizes our world are winning because they are interested in power for the sake of power, and that they have a psychology that maps to a set of strategies and tactics that are simply more effective than people who are interested in power for the sake of broader objectives, not because they are smarter than everyone else or work harder or anything like that. And that when we transcend self-referentiality, when we stop taking sociopolitical measures that are ultimately designed to have an effect in a world where everybody is more like us than they actually are, when we transcend self-referentiality, we begin to see the whole tactical and strategic playing field as it actually exists, and we begin to engage it on its own terms. So that's it for now. Thank you so much for listening. Next time I am going to begin a very long journey that I don't know, am I starting a 3-part series? I'm starting to do something that's as ambitious as what I started this podcast with, the 3-part series, The Biology of the Right-Left Divide, but which I have admittedly mapped out with far less precision. So I've done all the research. I know what I want to say, but I haven't, in the case of The Biology of the Right-Left Divide, I had written a paper about it. So that was this huge opportunity to spend a bunch of laborious hours and days structuring the work, and I don't have anything remotely equivalent for this. So I just have this pretty massive trove of research I want to cite and a list of points I want to make. But I'm going to be talking about 2, I think, very deeply interrelated things that on their surface don't have any explicit relationship, which is what kinds of societies are ultimately possible, or what is the range of variation that has been documented in existing human societies. So that on the one hand, and then the question of the politics of division and why egalitarian political movements are so prone to conflict on the other. And these questions have something to do with one another because both of them are intimately related to the story of social sciences as it emerged in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, and the ideological disputes that occurred within social sciences and the forms of reasoning that people within obscure academic departments who nobody actually remembers, or very few people actually remember anymore, the forms of reasoning that they employed to pursue different ideological agendas about what humanity ultimately is and what humanity is ultimately capable of, and how these forms of reasoning gradually sort of diffused out of academia and into social movements. And I'm really, really looking forward to doing it, although I do think that it may be a little bit of a chaotic ride. But it's going to be fun. We'll get to talk about, hunter-gatherer ethnographies and, all the rest, violence in hunter-gatherer societies, all that kind of contentious hot button, all that stuff that people immediately read a giant morality tale into and have really a whole lot of trouble just engaging on factual terms a lot of the time. It's going to be fun, probably make people mad, probably make people laugh, probably some people think it's great, some people think it's terrible, but I'm really looking forward to it, so stay tuned for that and keep loving, keep fighting.